welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another Take 5 for Florida history. All museums are history museums. It doesn't matter what the museum contains, it's really all about history. They're filled with old stuff. Some of it's really old stuff and some of it's newer stuff, but it doesn't really matter, since history starts yesterday and moves backwards in time. This video is about art museums in Florida, and to me the best art museums are those that inform visitors about the history of the art that's on their walls. While it's fine to enjoy art without knowing anything about its history, most artwork comes to life knowing more. Great art museums inform about the artist, their life, their desires, the time and place in which they lived, their motivations, and even being driven to create art. Then there's the art itself. Art is usually created to represent something, and since art is created by humans, all art contains a human perspective. The artist is saying something in their work, and there's often a conscious message as well as a subconscious message. All of that is history. But you want to know the most interesting thing about art? Understanding art doesn't end with the artist's intent. Art is remarkable in that anyone can interpret it the way they want. My perspective of an artwork can be shaped by understanding what the artist was saying, but I can use my own life experience to accept or modify or even reject the original meaning. In this video, I was lucky enough to spend some time with the Orlando Museum of Art's chief curator, and in part, that's what a curator does. They interpret art, starting with the artist, learning what they can of the time and place the work was created, and moving that history into the present to provide a context that informs the public as to why and how the artwork remains relevant today. So the impetus for this video was my friend suggesting that we head to the Orlando Museum of Art to see a traveling exhibit called Torn Apart: Punk and New Wave Graphics, Fashion and Culture, 1976 to 86. Those styles of music and period of time are very important to me. I've been a fan of punk rock and its associated genres since that time, and I've been lucky enough to have seen a number of the bands back then and bought their music when you could only get it on vinyl records. It was an interesting exhibition, and I thought I'd do a video that covered the subject, and I wanted to bring it back to Florida's tourism history. However, there's little connection between Florida tourism and punk rock. But the exhibition itself spoke to me on a number of levels, and I thought I'd show some of the artwork, plus the chief curator will talk about the exhibit as well. I'll also look at a handful of other art museums in the state that are tourist destinations. Before I start, I'd like to mention that I now have a Patreon account. The link is in the description. If you enjoy my videos, please consider becoming one of my patrons. All the cool kids are doing it. The 101-year-old Orlando Museum of Art presents a mid-sized collection and is popular with locals. It's one of the anchors of Loch Haven Park, the Arts and Sciences Center of Orlando. Located between three lakes, Estelle, Formosa, and Rowena. No, ironically, there is no Loch Haven. The name came from a neighborhood development venture that failed due to the Great Depression. The city park is also the home of the Orlando Shakespeare Theater, the Orlando Science Center, the Manello Museum of Art, the Orlando Family Stage, Orlando Garden Club, and the Orlando Fire Museum. Nearby is the Orlando Ballet and Lou Botanical Gardens. Loch Haven Park is also the home of the Orlando Fringe Festival, the country's oldest and largest fringe festival. I've called this video Art of Underground Art partly because Florida isn't thought of as a great art museum destination compared to New York, Los Angeles, Paris, and London. And because of the nature of much of Florida tourism, cultural institutions such as art museums take a back seat to the theme parks, beaches, scuba diving, and fishing. But there are a number of world-class art museums in the state. It's funny to consider them to be underground, but while the most popular of them see up to 500,000 visitors a year, the Magic Kingdom could see that many guests in 15 days. Underground also refers to the Torn Apart exhibition. Its subject has significant underground elements that originally separated it from mainstream art and music movements. Torn Apart is a temporary traveling exhibition, something that's common to many museums. Traveling art exhibitions are popular in that they bring in different art than the host museum has, or art that complements and expands the museum's collection. They're also popular with museums because they usually bring in new visitors or get regular visitors to come back to the museum. They give people different art to see, though the funny thing is that museums have far more art than they could ever display to the public at one time, and so they regularly rotate their displays. While the most popular or significant art stays on display all the time, visitors would see new things several times a year. And I can promise you one other thing. Museum staff don't want to see the same art day after day either. Let's get into the interview with the Chief Curator of Orlando Museum of Art. She'll first talk about the development of the Torn Apart exhibit.
Thank you very much, Tom. My name is Coralie Claeysen-Gleyzon. I am the Chief Curator at the Orlando Museum of Art, and it's a pleasure to have you here today with us. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Torn Apart exhibition, which is an exhibition that was curated by Michael Worthington. He is a professor at Cal Arts in California, and Michael has curated various exhibitions based on the Torn Apart collection. So the collection comes from Andrew Kruvine, who is a collector based in New York, who would spend his entire summers in the 70s and 80s in London. He would visit his cousin, who had a punk shop in London. And so that's how he got connected to that scene. Andrew Kruvine collected over 1,000 posters and flyers and pieces of memorabilia over the years. This is the first time that exhibition was shown to such an extent. So the exhibition has been curated a couple times prior at the Pacific Center for the Arts, for example, and then it traveled to the Southern Methodist University in Texas, in Dallas. Both renditions were really small, pocket exhibitions that showed a little bit of the collection, but not the breadth of it. And that was really exciting to be able to show it in such an incredible rendition at the Orlando Museum of Art in our biggest gallery. So the addition that we made to this specific exhibition was that not only we included the posters, the flyers, the memorabilia, the buttons, the pins, we were able to also include a separate collection of garments that were designed by Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren. And that collection, again, a few pieces had been shown in the two previous shows, but that was the first time we showed most of that collection. That collection belongs to Malcolm Garrett, who is, believe it or not, one of the incredible designers of Torn Apart posters. He worked with Dan Drnach, for example, working with the band from the very earliest days to today. So really kind of interconnected relationships right there. What was fascinating to me in the process as well was that we were also able to include photography. So throughout the exhibition, you would see large-scale mural photographs of Sheila Rock photographs. Sheila was a member of that scene. She would be a part of that scene and kind of casually capture what was happening around her, just documenting the scene around her. What happened throughout that process is that she ended up, capturing incredible portraits. So we have Johnny Rotten, we have Billy Idol captured in this beautiful scene at the time that nowadays have become, iconic portraits. We had an entire gallery dedicated to Sheila Rock's photography as well. Again, that was not, that didn't happen in the previous two renditions of the show. So really the show was really beautifully well-rounded on those three aspects: photography, graphic design, and fashion, as three kind of interconnected elements of the cultural scenes of the punks, the punk scene of the 70s to the 80s. For me, it was really important to bring this exhibition to the OMA because we are an art museum. So we foster, an understanding and sharing on the mission of sharing art, cultivating new ideas through the art means, But bringing in the punk scene allowed us to, cater to a different audience, people that are interested in graphic design, in the music industry, in the fashion industry, in photography, but may not naturally come to an art museum. They came to see the Torn Apart exhibition. And it was really exciting because while they came to enjoy something that was familiar to them, they then also encountered things that were not familiar to them in adjacent galleries as well. So they were able to see our permanent collection. They were able to marvel at a Nick Cave sound suit, and it was really beautiful to be able to see that and make that connection between, affiliated audiences that may not have connected otherwise.
So at this point, I'm briefly showing a number of the posters and flyers from the Torn Apart exhibit. I wanted to include the music along with them, but the songs would get the video demonetized and possibly censored. So what I've done is made a separate video, which I've put on my Patreon page. On here, I've added royalty-free music that is sort of punk. I encourage you to check out the video. It has a lot more of the exhibit, great music, and you can view it with a 7-day free trial membership to Patreon. The posters I chose are from the bands I loved 40 years ago and still love, so it's not really a balanced perspective of the exhibition, but we don't have time for that anyway.
Yes. So as soon as you enter the space, you are surrounded by these posters, bold graphics, colorful. There was actually a lot of careful curation happening. It was chronologically ordered. There were walls that were thematically curated as well. So you had women in punk, you had the activism, protest, movement. You had a Barney Bubbles, graphic design wall. You have, graphic designer specific walls as well. But within that kind of plethora of posters, you had absolute gems. It was great to be able to see how they're all interconnected,
Torn Apart was interesting in that it wasn't the typical art show. Some people might question if the flyers and posters are really art, especially since many of them are minimally designed, created quickly, and were promotional material. Of course, none of that automatically stops them from being art, plus there's the retrospective aspect. It's common for creative works to eventually be considered art by people years after they were made. Once again, history starts yesterday and moves back in time.
To me, a really important element was also to connect with students, students that are studying art history or graphic design. Well, right there within one exhibition, they were able to get fed, with both the influences, the art historical influences that informed the posters that ended up being graphic design. And then that graphic design was actually also almost a product design, if you think about it. It was meant to be used. It was a functional item that would get pinned to a club corridor or, a cafe wall, or those posters were meant to be used to convey a message. Message today in the art world is key. A lot of times nowadays the art you're creating needs to be connected to some sort of message, needs to have an impact. And right there you had impactful posters. You even had those protest posters were really kind of important as well at conveying messages that were very specific, but that today still ring true. So I think there was elements as well that people weren't expecting. A lot of times people came because they were interested in the nostalgic element. They could connect to that scene. They said, oh my goodness, this wall looks like my bedroom wall. But it was also relevant to audiences today, the younger generation that may connect to the music scene of the punk, movement, or to the counter movement, element of it, and also to just the freeing way that, to be able to convey messages, with a full impact, that full force, of going visually with a medium that's, sometimes as small as a tiny flyer, but, the impact of what you say in a few words, in an image, in an incredible graphic, and how impactful that can be. So that's a great question. I think we want to always be a little bit pushing the envelope on what we do, kind of redefining what the role of a museum in the 21st century is. Because yes, we deal with objects. Very often they're objects that are precious, they put in display cases, they're to be revered. There was an element to this show that allowed us to go beyond that. The idea of being irreverent is interesting to me because what one group of the population may value as being very valuable or very worthy of being in a museum may not be what another group of the population may think that may be. And kind of, I think I love the cross dialogue that happens here, something that is actually may look irreverent to somebody, may actually be revered by another group. I love the idea of people meeting each other on a common ground. So I really love the museum being positioned as being that common ground where meaningful conversations can happen. And I really believe in people meeting the other, in a place where we can discuss ideas in a safe place, and kind of, again, pushing, what our boundaries of comfortable is. That doesn't mean that we are being irrespectful. I think everything in that exhibition deserves to be in that exhibition, if you see what I mean. There is merit, and that's what we do. So what we bring into the museum, there is merit to it. Because there's a great conversation that can happen from it. There's a great educational component that can happen from it. And that ultimately is what drives our goal. It's what is the merit educationally, and what is the merit to the community.
In viewing the exhibition and knowing about the history of punk rock, it reminded me that punk's development was similar to a number of visual art movements, especially the early Impressionist movement of the mid to late 19th century. Impressionism was an artistic style that went against the accepted norms of art at the time. There's no time to go into the artwork itself, though here's a few examples. The main thing is that the Impressionists ran up against the status quo of mainstream art in Paris. Not only were established artists hostile to the Impressionists, the public was too. The Impressionists couldn't be considered an organized group since they were primarily unified by their spirit of independence and rebellion, and they were essentially pushed underground, much the way punk rock would be 100 years later. At the time, there was an official annual juried art show, the Salon de Paris, and artists who did well in the salon could expect their careers to become more successful. However, the Impressionists, generally, were not allowed to show their work. Eventually, they'd create their own shows, and over time, their work became not only accepted by the public, but Impressionism would become one of the most respected and beloved painting styles in history.
I love that point, and the other thing is that you never know what is going to inspire the next generation as well. If you always get to see the same things over and over, and you're very comfortable in your little environment, really it doesn't bring you the kind of fresh, input of ideas or kind of that influx of new fresh, inspiration as well. And so a lot of the things we do are geared to, have an educational purpose. I mentioned that, but really kids, young adults, students, and then lifelong learning as well. And I think there's a great thing to explore there, that first little seed that you plant that you never know where it comes from. For me, my connection to the art world literally came from a book, and you never know where it may come from.
The final subject I asked was about the profession of curator. It's not a well-understood job, yet it's an important one in all manner of museums: art, science, technology, and even just plain history.
I love that question. So to me, the role of a curator is that of a mediator. What we do is literally we're the connecting thread between an artist, an artwork, and the public, really. We are making those connections happen. And so that includes research, of course, a lot of research. What is going to be meaningful? What do we want to say? What message do we want to say? We're also storytellers. We are in the process of selecting. A lot of times the curator, for years has been described as a gatekeeper. Who makes it in the museum? Who do we keep out? And that's, I kind of reject that, the idea. Of course, we can't put everything, it's impossible, but we need to be relevant. We need to be relevant to today's world. We need to be relevant to the community. We need to be relevant to 100 years legacy. I mean, our museum is 100 years old, 101 this year, And so how do we honor that past, so that it's still relevant today, but also kind of gear the museum towards being ready for the next 100 years. And so that's what the role of the curator is, really. We make sense of this. I mentioned we received a beautiful, generous gift from the Dr. Cottrell and Mr. Joe Lovett's collection last year. That's over 300 works of their private collection that was donated to the museum. And, that gift, how do we prepare it so that it's palatable for the community? How do we curate? How do we tell that story? And the result is the Beautiful Relationships exhibition, which describe, their act of collecting, their act of caring for artists, living artists, and their act of caring for the Orlando and Central Florida community by donating that gift. And so, again, that's my role there. How do I interpret this gift so that the community in Orlando feels connected to it? They feel that, yes, it is their gift too. Ultimately the museum is the repository of a collection that is actually the community's collection. So my role is to care for that collection. That means maintenance, that means conservation, that means kind of making sure it's safe, secure, preserved for posterity. It means interpreting it, so that's through research, writing, of text panels, what we call interpreting, the collection, recontextualizing, collections are always changing, even ancient artifacts, that the research changes on those items, and then we need to be relevant to today's research and to be in the current dialogue as well about those works. So that's kind of a little bit of what I do, and of course, the next part is actually sharing it with people. So doing tours, working with collecting circles to expand the collection, and again, in a meaningful way that is relevant to the institution and the community.
As I said before, Florida is home to a number of world-class museums, all of which deserve a video of their own. I've covered a couple of them already, at least in part. Honestly, I prefer telling the history of some attractions than a number of videos to show their place in Florida history. Now, the four I want to talk about are the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art in Sarasota, the Norton Museum of Art in West Palm Beach, the Salvador Dali Museum in St. Pete, and the Charles Hosmer Morse Museum of American Art in Winter Park. The first two are the largest in Florida, while the other two share similar remarkable stories. Known these days simply as the Ringling, it's one of the oldest museums in the state, having first opened in 1930. The museum's original collection was put together by John and Mabel, who grew rich operating the world's largest circus. One of America's richest families, they often visited Europe while their circus wintered in Sarasota. While there, they bought hundreds of paintings by the old masters such as Rubens, Gainsborough, Poussin, Velázquez, and Bernini. Remarkably, Ringling donated the museum to the state of Florida. You can see that story here. And the museum has continued to grow for nearly 100 years. In a similar vein, the Norton, located across the state from the Ringling, began as the personal collection of another wealthy family, Ralph and Elizabeth Norton from Chicago. Opened in 1941, it has its share of European masters, including Rubens, Reynolds, Gainsborough, and Van Dyck. During the last 80-plus years, the Ringling and Norton have expanded and house a full range of art styles from some of the oldest to the works of current artists. Both regularly welcome 500,000 visitors a year, many of them tourists from around the country and the world. Both Sarasota and West Palm Beach have been popular tourist destinations for many years, and their world-class art museums are part of the reason why. In a different way, the two other museums stand out just as much as the Ringling and Norton. While both are smaller museums, it's their unique collections that make them world-class. As you might be able to guess, the Salvador Dali Museum has as its permanent collection a large part of the life work of the Surrealist artist. The museum got its start in Cleveland, Ohio, in the home of Reynolds and Eleanor Morse when they befriended Dali and began collecting his work. That was in the 1950s, and it wasn't until 1971 when they opened their first museum, also in Cleveland. In 1982, the collection moved to St. Pete and opened on the waterfront. It has 2,400 Dali works, including paintings, drawings, book illustrations, artist books, prints, sculpture, photos, manuscripts, and a remarkable archive of documents. This allows the museum to present the life work of one of the most important and fascinating artists of the 20th century. The Morse Museum is similar and owes its remarkable collection to yet another husband and wife team, Jeanette and Hugh McKean. Yeah, the museum isn't named for the McKeans, and instead for Jeanette's grandfather, Charles Morse, no relation to the Morses that created the Dali Museum. Originally, the museum opened in 1942 on the campus of Rollins College. Hugh McKean had been a student of Louis Comfort Tiffany's estate in New York, and in 1955 the Morse held the first exhibition of Tiffany's works after the artist's death. 2 years later, the Tiffany estate burned to the ground, and the McKeans, along with Tiffany's daughter, decided to save as much of the art and other Tiffany creations as they could. That's how the museum, founded by the McKeans and named after a grandfather, became the unofficial Tiffany Museum, with the largest collection of his artwork in any museum around the world. It even includes the Tiffany Chapel, created for the 1893 World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. I take a longer look at the Morse in this video. Both Dali and Morse are good tourist draws in their respective cities and represent world-class collections, plus research opportunities for art historians. Now, one of the interesting things is that the Morse Museum is only 3 miles or less than 5 kilometers from the Orlando Museum of Art. I'd consider a great deal of art to include these museums along with the Manila Museum near the OMA and the Album Polasek Museum and Rollins Museum of Art near the Morse. The Rollins Museum is currently on the campus of Rollins College, but like the Morse, it will move to a new building off campus but still nearby. As you can see by this map, visiting the 5 museums would be very nice by bike. However, you can even do it using Sunrail, the area's commuter rail, which happens to have stops within blocks of the museums. Getting back to the Morse, I'm not saying that it's a big draw for tourists on its own. It's located on Park Avenue, in the heart of the popular shopping and eating district of Old Winter Park. Park Avenue was a popular destination for tourists even before Disney World opened in 1971. Along with the nearby campus of Rollins College, thousands of visitors to Florida visit the Park Avenue area every year, and so the Morse regularly sees visitors from all over the U.S. Contrast that to the Orlando Museum of Art and its neighboring cultural institutions. They're only 12 miles or 20 kilometers from the Universal Resort and the main tourist area, though they're not visited by the vast majority of people who vacation in Orlando. The Orlando metropolitan area, with nearly 3 million people, is a diverse, creative, and prosperous area. It's the home of many museums which rely on locals for the majority of their visitors. For comparison, the Orlando metro area has a nearly identical population with the Charlotte, North Carolina metro area, which has a modest number of tourist visits annually. Meanwhile, Orlando is the #1 tourist destination in the world with 74 million visitors in 2023. And that's Orlando's great paradox. Now, people argue that there's so much to do between Disney World, Universal, SeaWorld, outlet malls, and all the smaller attractions that surround them that there's simply no time. And yes, to a point that's true, but people make time for what they really want to do on holiday, and for nearly everyone, an Orlando vacation doesn't mean Orlando. It means theme parks and everything that comes along with them. Thank you for watching another of my videos. I hope you enjoyed it. If you learned something, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more on Florida's tourism history. And please check out my Patreon account. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.